By February 18, 1775, the 13 colonies, which should soon compose the United States of America, were on the brink of revolutionary war with the Empire of Great Britain. After the official end of unofficial sanitary neglect in 1763, it became increasingly difficult for England and its American colonies to coexist when Parliament passed overbearing laws and restrictions on the colonies' trade and taxes that caused inconvenience in their daily lives. Some of these acts include the Stamp Act in 1765, the Declaratory Act in 1766, the Townshend Acts in 1767, and the Tea Act in 1773. The majority of these acts were used to tax the American settlers in order to help England pay off the heavy war debts from the 7 Years' War that they engaged in with France. When Prime Minister George Grenville decided to reduce the tax on sugar and molasses, but enforce the law more strictly, the first protest that would eventually lead to a full-scale war began. Taking actions against the English government began as soon as the first tax was enforced with the Sugar Act in 1764. Throughout the decade before the Revolutionary War, major protests such as the Stamp Act Congress, actions of the Sons of Liberty, boycotts and petitions, the Massachusetts Circular Letter, and the Boston Tea Party had taken place. These protests, ranging from peaceful to violent, were performed to send a message to the King and Parliament in England, and on occasion they were successful. For example, the English government repealed the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts after major protests that damaged England's economy, in some cases costing the government over half of its revenue in the span of a couple of years. George Mason, considered a founding father of this nation, was born and raised in the colony of Virginia, where he grew up to be one of the richest planters. As a child, Mason was educated mostly in law, and as an adult, he pursued his political interests. In 1759, Mason was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, and when the Stamp Act provoked outrage in the colonies, Mason was quick to write an open letter explaining the colonists' position to a committee of London merchants to enlist their support. Throughout the following years, he was a justice of the Fairfax County Court and a trustee in the city of Alexandria. In 1774, George Mason was again found at the forefront of political events when he contributed to the creation of the Fairfax Resolves, which outlined the colonists' reason for their objection to the Boston Port Act, and was presented to the House of Burgesses by Mason's fellow Virginian, George Washington, on July 18, 1774. George Mason's letter, written to his colleague, George Washington, in February of 1775, was concerning the collection of taxes required for the establishment of civil government in the colonies, separate from the rule of the British monarch and his royal governors. In this letter, Mason begins by addressing Washington as his friend and stating that he feels it an obligation that his friends express whatever doubts they may have about his demeanor with freedom and honesty so that Mason himself is not misrepresented. He then goes on to say that he is confident that George Washington, his longtime friend and colleague, had misinterpreted his intentions, quote, in making the collection I, being Mason, had mentioned, end quote. This is referring to the collection of taxes made necessary by the General Assembly in order to support civilian governments in the colonies. This letter's introduction also reflects the beginning of a rift in the relationship between George Mason and George Washington. Historians often cite the two men as longtime friends whose relationship suffered but was not completely lost when they had vastly different political ideas and Mason refused to sign the Constitution in 1787. It is proven from letters such as Mason's letter to his son John in 1789 that Mason believed the former statement true and still saw Washington as a close friend. However, it is thought that a more accurate description of their friendship is one of unevenness, which did terminate after the debate over the Constitution. From Washington's account of the relationship, it is clear to see that the friendship was very one-sided and that Mason's admiration was not fully reciprocated. The uneven friendship can be used to display why it is so easy for Washington to misinterpret Mason's desire to collect the taxes necessary for creating colonial governments made by the settlers themselves. George Mason then goes on in the letter to say that, begin quote, was either of us, referring to him in Washington, to take the advantage of receiving what he could from those who are most able and willing to pay, leaving the other to scuffle as he could with the rest, it would not only be unequal and ungenerous, but absolutely dishonest. The thing is self-evident and needs no proof, end quote. This is commenting on how the taxes are imbalanced between the richer colonists and those in poverty. Although Mason does not suggest anything to correct the fact that the wealthy easily pay what is asked of them while the poor can barely conjure up the money, he mentions the fact to Washington. By stating the former, Mason shows his views on the underprivileged and that the laws and taxes should comply with their individual needs as part of the majority group. In the second paragraph of this brief letter to George Washington, George Mason expresses his confusion and concerns with the timing of the collection of the taxes. He states that by collecting the money later in the summer, they would be allowed to collect the optimal amount, and in turn, they, begin quote, would not only save commissions, but expedite the business and reimburse us so much the sooner, end quote. However, Mason then rebutes this idea and states that he believes the collection could be made more easily at the current time, the time which the letter was written, rather than when it was originally planned for. This refers to Mason's precaution towards the Revolutionary War, which was at this point imminent. The General Assembly established those taxes in order to create and support a civil government that would be able to control the population when war actually commenced. By pushing to have these taxes collected sooner, George Mason demonstrates the urgency held by some of the most influential political leaders at the time. However, further into this letter, Mason discusses how the money collected can be wired between people in ways that result in Mason, begin quote, making a partial collection for my, being Mason's, own separate benefit, end quote. The urgency Mason is displaying for the colony of Virginia has now become his own personal urgency, as he is explaining the ways by which he can profit from the collection. Mason ends this paragraph by explaining to Washington that, begin quote, it cannot but give me, referring to Mason, concern that I shouldn't be thought capable of such disingenuous conduct. I, again referring to Mason, may perhaps be blamable for not explaining myself fully before, but in a matter so palpable, I had no conception that it was necessary, end quote. In these final sentences, Mason is addressing the reason for the letter, which is Washington's misconception of his reasoning for the collection. In this portion of the letter, Mason is very vague and does not specifically give the reasons as to why he would want to commit a disingenuous act. However, he explains that he does have reasoning and thought he did not find it necessary to be explained. In the brief ending to this brief letter in its entirety, Mason explains that since residing in Maryland for the Potomac River Bill, he has no power over the law or policies of Virginia. He then promises his friend that he will, begin quote, apply to it as soon as I can, and when finished, forward it to you, referring to Washington, end quote. Mason then goes on to fleetingly state that he has found out via a letter from Maryland that the king has ordered his ambassadors to declare the American colonists in a state of rebellion. George Mason is very abrupt and curt when speaking about the state of the nation as a whole and the condition of the colony's relationship with Britain, showing that at the current point in time he is not primarily concerned with the impending war with the empire. The final sentence of this letter is, begin quote, I am, with my compliments to Mrs. Washington and the family at Mount Vernon, dear sir, your affectionate and obedient servant, end quote. In the end of the letter, Mason again displays how he admired Washington and their supposed friendship, although Washington was hesitant to return the respect.